Welcome to yet another edition of Fresh Off the Boat. This is our podcast in the times of COVID, reconnecting with students I've known over the years. It's my pleasure to be chatting with Megha Chaudhary. She graduated from Lady Shri Ram College, Delhi University. Later, you'll have to fill in the years, etc., but I'm just moving on. Then, serendipitously, she sort of learned certain skills and is now heavily engrossed in work in a company. Is it your company, Megha? Teamhouse?
No, it's Treemouse. I'm in the capacity of a principal, but this was started by a bunch of people within the design space itself. So the founder is Nishita Gill, and there was an initial team that started this venture with her.
Very interesting name, Treemouse. And we'll learn more about how her life panned out and also her education at the Indian School of Business. So, first question to you, Megha. What was it like knowing the fact that studying at Sanskriti, where so many students go studying abroad, and you chose to stay back in India? Was there FOMO? At that time, probably this phrase wasn't coined, but do you think there was a huge disadvantage or, in retrospect, a huge advantage having sort of created your networks in India?
I think I'll be honest that it's sort of a decision or something that I think about in cycles of 3 to 4 years. So immediately out of Sanskriti, that I don't think was an active consideration to say that let's go out and study, and simply because I think at that point in time, some of the directions which I felt I was clear about, which was to say that I did want to pursue a career in communication design and marketing, and from that perspective I found India to be a very, very interesting place to be in, purely just because of the kind of multiple narratives that you see around, problems across, whether there's no such thing as a unified identity of who's Indian, and that was interesting. At the same time, this was also a point when I graduated, like still a blur, but I think mid 2010, where foray on digital for India had just started in a very big way. Everybody was, beginning to warm up to the idea of social media, of what you could do online, humanizing those experiences. So just that opportunity itself within the context of the larger playing ground, which I think at that point in time was coming across, was very interesting. So there was a time where, in fact, I had cleared, I'm forgetting the name of the program, but this was a exchange between the government of UK and India, and I'd through that I'd got a job. But I decided to pursue this because just the idea of being immersed in a new spectrum within the country and an interesting startup, I think just qualified, hands down.
Surely.
So,
So,
yeah.
yeah, and about ISB then, when did that decision become sort of cemented in your head, and what was the experience at ISB?
So I'd put in about 2.5 to 3 years at Drizzlin, which was the startup I had joined freshly out of college. Was like a very interesting and a dynamic workspace, and taught me a lot, even in terms of very, very, very interesting segues in terms of business development, while also looking at the strategy side of things, creative. A lot of things were coming together. Having said that, at that point in time, I think I would say that I learned to think digitally because of the team at Drizzlin, which to me, even today, is a very enabling skill set, because you do tend to look at things in a very different way from that perspective. Having said that, the market at that point in time was still evolving for a larger uptake of what was considered, very for digital or social media strategies in general. And it was just curiosity to say that, okay, I think I'm occupying between 1 to 5% of a larger brand's outlay at that time. It's interesting how that's increased many-fold today. But what are these other nuts and bolts that come into play? Like what really is the larger ballgame around marketing and strategic communication? So that's when, I thought that an MBA would make sense. And ISP again came into consideration because I thought the idea of a 2-year MBA versus one where that's condensed, and also the fact that since I'd put in some amount of years behind me in terms of work experience, I was fairly curious to see what it would be to be in a mixed batch where, where that spectrum could keep changing. So I think that kind of then started cementing the decision to say that it's been a good amount of time figuring this out, and I sort of knew where I would go had I not taken that shift to say, let me go ahead and study. And within ISB, then the experience, I think I would always say, is an interesting mixed bag. So you learned a lot from your peers. It's a very, very powerful alum circle. But I think purely from my perspective, the initial bits were sort of difficult because my profile, or at least coming from a very, very different experience work wise, it took me a while to shift gears to really understand how I fit into, say, the larger nomenclature of a business school. So that's been an interesting journey, and I think I learned a lot in that process. One of, I think, the biggest takeaways are just the strongest set of people that I hold true even today, work-wise or even in terms of personal relationships. But yeah, it was a sort of a roller coaster ride where it took me a while to figure out where can I really fit in this larger spectrum of
Sure.
what
So
happens in
if
a B
you
school.
were to sort of reflect back more into what is an MBA curriculum at ISB, what worked for you, what was maybe not as effective for you personally, and any inspirations which you draw from people there or even the resources that were offered.
I think one of the biggest vantage points, I was in the second batch for the Mohali campus. So, firstly, for ISB, there is no, it doesn't follow the IIMA model where everything is campus specific for all, basically it is, at the end of the day, it's operating out of Hyderabad and Mohali. But there's a lot of flexibility in how you can approach your curriculum. So, the biggest thing that I think worked for me was that for this almost 1 year immersion, a good part of it in the second half of your choice of electives exposed me to a lot more than I had anticipated. I feel I came in with blinders on to say that okay, this is going to be about figuring out the larger bigger picture about marketing, like I just said. But through the duration of the program, a lot of interest in operations, a lot of interest in sustainability, communications, and in parallel, actually, some very basic courses around finance modeling and film. I could not understand would have come very close to actually shaping the kind of career choices I took later on. And we'll build on that in a bit.
Sure.
So the fluidity there was one. Secondly, the fact that since this was the second year of the Mohali campus in running, a lot of the faculty which was coming in through ISB's Global Connects was in Mohali. So the advantage of sitting in the same classroom, but being exposed to pedagogies which were sort of global again, was a very, very interesting experience that came through. In terms of what didn't work, I would say that I think certainly at the end of the day, it is a B school that is geared towards more of shaping or at least solving for the larger side of a consultancy led practice, in terms of how even people who want to pursue this would be heavier on that side. So you had to find your feet around certain, if you had to really go deep in subjects which may not have been top of consideration for a lot of people. That could mean even in terms of just the kind of electives you took for communication marketing. So I think balancing that is not a default, where, and it's typical for any school, right? Every B school is known for something. So you've got to find your way through that. And the inspirational bit, like I mentioned, that you had a mixed crowd. Everybody came in with a good amount of work experience. And what really blew me away was just the spaces from which people came. Like we had people who joined in from the army. We had urban developers who ended up becoming you have taken up very big careers in banking. We had mothers who, within just the first 2 or 3 years of having a baby, were managing the stress of a B school and that. So I think a lot of personal learnings and inspirations on multiple fronts there.
That's great. So, in a way, it was your first residential university experience, and it did not disappoint you. And you took the leap of faith and enrolled in a very new setup. But do you see ISB Hyderabad and Mohali actually collaborating a lot? Is it very different? Like you said, IIMs might be working in their own silos.
So, for purposes to say that, can you draw from just the larger shared space from a placements perspective, from faculty, it's one campus. Of course, as you spend time on a specific campus, you do draw larger affiliations there. We were the second batch in Mohali, and I think in comparison, sort of a closer crop of people. I believe now that I think even Mohali has scaled up way more in terms of its intake, but at that time it was less than half of what Hyderabad was. So it was, as a campus, very well connected, very well rooted in terms of understanding where everybody came from. I think everybody literally knew the other person by name. I can't always say that was the case for people in Hyderabad too. So, in that sense, on collaboration fronts, you did have student organized events, and you had student bodies which constantly were in conversation with each other to figure out, larger specificities like the marketing club, so on and so forth. You also had very interesting exchange chapters. So, for the second half of your curriculum, you could decide to switch your campus if the course of your choosing was actually on the other campus as well. So that again is a very interesting experience where midway you can decide and completely immerse yourself on the other side.
So that's pretty interesting. So there were deep linkages, and they currently do exist as
Yes.
well. Uh, so if you were to look at the day in the life of an ISB student and reflect a little bit on that,
Mm-hmm.
what would you have to say?
Arjun, one of the first things where when we joined, excuse me, even on our orientation, there was this phrase to say that this is going to be like a roller coaster ride for the next rest of the year, but it's going to be an interesting year. I think that's the way to describe it, because you're tested on multiple fronts. You're also coming from a time where you've left your a certain sense of a staticness in your careers, or you a certain sense of familiarity around you. So it's a completely new setup with new people, courses which you may not necessarily know. So the first term is very interesting because just the combination of subjects and people, you'll always be at a position where you may not know as much as anybody else in the class, and but you've still got to catch up. So it's very hectic in terms of just the pace with classes during the day, and then you've got to keep following that up with assignments. There is a lot of emphasis on group work, which I think is interesting, because that is one skill, or at least that's one part of the experience you do carry forth in your careers when you have to keep navigating conversations moving forth. I think it's also a lot of systematic decision making which comes to you. So it's not a linear program by all means. The first 4 months are, literally sort of a wake up call to say that this requires a certain degree of rigor. And by the time you get used to establishing your rhythm around it, that's when the beauty of just figuring out what you have to do is all the more interesting. So the second part of the last two terms specifically are very high on how you want to customize your final MBA. So is it operations? Is it marketing? And that also comes on a reward point based system. So you're clearly taking decisions at every point in time with a limited resource to say, this is what I really want to do. So the optioneering at that point in time becomes very interesting. We've had examples of people thinking that they wanted to pursue one thing, but when they got exposed to a larger set of ideas, changed courses midway. The opportunities for exchange, again, all of this is already very heavy on the academic side. The other interesting bits also then come in where just formats like we had the ISB Premier League, which is sort of a sports tournament which is completely conducted from scratch. And what I mean by that is even that goes deep into managing what it takes to manage a sports team as well. So there's actual bidding, there's actual money. You're actually talking about performances. People are budding up as owners, they are budding up as team members on one side of the sport. So a lot of this then kind of has this interesting sense of camaraderie also that starts building. But I think at the end of the day, it's just that you're pushed in different directions, and if eventually you need to find a certain sense of semblance for you. The pedagogy is not limited to the classroom. All these examples push you out, and you constantly then keep figuring out, okay, what's the best way I can articulate, or what's my expression of doing
Fascinating.
something
Yeah.
very different.
It seems that you could definitely be the director of admissions of ISB. Clearly, I'm sure they might have approached you Or do you think everyone is as passionate as you are about the experience and the learning?
I would say
So
this
well,
is, yeah, more hindsight. At that time, I'll be honest, I hated it because this was just like, when does this get over? But yeah,
one
a
blur.
lot of it. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And the whole idea of the reward points and everything sounds very corporate, right?
It
And now
does.
now you live a life which is seems like generally people in the creative industry, marketing slash creative industry, they do have a lot of fire and they do have targets, but I'm sure there's also that side of you, the creative side of you, which yearns for that this blue ocean and just clear thinking and finding your me time. Uh, so, do you think what in reality you want in life is very different from what ISB prepares you for? Or it's kind of a
Um,
mix?
I think it's kind of a mix, to be honest. Like, it's what it certainly prepared you for is just the kind of rigor or the kind of hours you would anticipate in keeping with those jobs. But if I really, not just me, if I really think about a lot of my peers, I think just the consideration for what is it that I really want work wise, very interesting pivots in terms of jobs, in terms of how
Yeah,
you
tell us
want to
about your
work.
journey. Yeah, I think tell us about that too, and then connect it to the question.
So, like I said, I think for me, the first foray broadly into, what I also feel is very evolving as a set of marketing or branding communication was digital first. I learned how to think on digital mediums before I even went deep into what's the larger 360-degree view of how do you create a brand or how do you even talk about marketing as a day-to-day reality for different things. ISP was, in that sense, it came in to say it was more than a 360-degree view where it was just not about one function, but it helped you think about what it would mean to run a larger setup or an entity from very, very different perspectives. So post that, I joined the Godrej Group, and I joined a special practice within the Godrej Group that existed at that time. It was called the Strategic Marketing Group. Our job was basically to keep a bird's eye view on how different initiatives within the space of marketing, brand, and research translated, because a group with over about 120 years of existence meant that articulation of brands was very different there, but there was also an opportunity about what you could leverage as brand Godrej. I joined the digital team where we were still very early in terms of our initial forays, in terms of understanding how does Godrej start creating more opportunities for itself online. And I think the first 2 years again were very interesting. So I've never really, from that perspective, I would say, had a corporate job per se. I've somehow always found, even within bigger conglomerates like Godrej, smaller teams which were possibly doing slightly trying to do things differently. So here the idea was that how do you start creating more opportunities for branded engagements, or even how does the internet become a very interesting space to operate for a entity like Godrej that comes in. So that was about 2.5 years, and I did then there was an interesting opportunity that opened up within Godrej. So why this is interesting is because till now, predominantly, like I said, digital first, and scaling to say, okay, from the agency side to the brand side, which always has also been a constant dilemma in my mind, that where do I really sit. So this opened up with Godrej Properties. They were launching their flagship project Trees, which is in Vikhroli. And I think for me was possibly one of the most interesting junctures to kind of take that up as an opportunity, because it wasn't a pure plain marketing role at all. So Vikhroli as a region within Godrej is very interesting because for Bombay, it has a lot of potential for the group. And I would say, was very lucky to get an opportunity to work in an in-house design studio, which Godrej Properties had. It was called the Godrej Properties Design Studio. I reported into the design head the studio head for GPL Design Studio, and the design head for the company was he was our region head as well. So this kind of came at a point where I had some initial interest in what it could mean to be on the design side, but like I said before or till now, my a lot of the validation was very heavy on the visual side of design, or the most obvious graphic side of design. Even within Drizzlin, it was more about how do you represent things very differently. This was an interesting opportunity. It kind of started merging design as a horizontal within different business specs. So design as a lens to marketing, design as a lens to sales, even from a business development standpoint. So it became a very interesting learning ground where you were forced to wear more than one hat. So at any point in time, I wasn't just the marketing manager for Trees, because I reported to the studio head of design, and there was a certain ethos which the project generally carried about how it had to be developed. So those decisions and getting immersed, I think, on the process side of design was very new to me. Operating in a studio setup in a larger corporate was a very interesting experience too, because just suddenly the way you approach problems, or the way you have to think about them, is going beyond the usual frameworks you got equipped with so far.
Well
And
said.
yeah.
Yeah, so I think even now segueing into Treemouse and the work that you're doing there, which is kind of an extension of maybe what you were doing at Godrej, or something totally new as well. So what is
Mhm.
your role here, and how do you see it evolving?
So, Treemouse is actually fairly different from Godrej Properties. It's to begin with, the focus at Treemouse is really to understand how, deeper behavior. So it's more behavioral in terms of its pursuit to say that can you start understanding nuances around people and how we live by getting deep into behavioral aspects of problems. And these can manifest themselves at any plane. It could be a marketing problem, it could be a product development problem. So from that approach now, the lens of design and research at Treemouse again is an entirely different dimension. It's not coming in, I would say it's very, very different from Godrej Properties, in the sense that it's heavily rooted in terms of understanding people around you in a very different way. So it's very heavy on that kind of an immersion. My role right now is that I look at the business development side, and also like in terms of projects, how do you start aligning? So you have this bit where there is the behavioral side, or there is the larger nudge factory side of things, but how do you start aligning that with bigger business problems? So as a setup, again, it's very interesting. We're a bunch of about 10-15 people, and collectively then we do start figuring out, what are the kind of opportunities that come, whether it's healthcare, whether it's fintech. So some of our projects are where we are working very closely with funded startups to understand, okay, what could be the next new dimension that comes in purely from an application use case which could drive more responsible behaviors towards financial saving and spending. We're working very closely within the healthcare space to talk about what does it take for people to stick to prescriptions in chronic illnesses, like especially if it's lifelong, what does it take for people to really come in? So I think the space Treemouse broadly occupies is between driving adoption and adherence. So some of the vocabulary, I would say, I carried through because of my previous stints, and it's sort of overlaying it in an entirely different lens to say that how do you create opportunities for wider uptake for ideas? And that's an ongoing journey at this stage.
Fascinating. I'm sure a lot of the linkages of a person who's a lifelong learner, wants to adapt and sort of look at design solutions for industries as varied as properties to, I'm sure, fintech and like health. Must be a very fast-paced life. Do you have uh, idea factories? How do you actually operate? If it's only a 15-member team, do you work on an agile work principle, scrums, team leaders, etc.? What is it that makes it tick? Because there's so many things going on, it seems, at
No, you're
Treemouse.
right. You're right. It's. I was, in terms of this being, it's interesting that you said that, Arjun. So fast-paced and agile. Agile certainly in terms of how we need to approach work. A lot of happy chaos too, because I think I can't think of a project where we started with saying that we will do this, and we actually ended up doing that. It keeps changing. That's really the nature of how you're looking at these projects, because the moment you start getting deeper into the kind of insights you're getting, you'll realize that there are actually three ways of looking at the same problem, or there is a higher potential somewhere. So it as a journey, I think this is an interesting place where projects do evolve in a co-creative mandate with clients. So from that perspective, it's very different to say that this is really the prescribed brief and please stick to it. I think the literally what you have to do on a project is an ongoing conversation. Fast paced, interestingly, not so much. I think just as a team demeanor, again, an interesting stat, this is 99% a women led team. Our problems on diversity are the other way around. But it's very reflective as a workspace. A lot of the time is really getting or gets expended in terms of really understanding that have we been able to cover every aspect of how this person or this set of people are thinking about this problem, or where do these opportunities lie. How we go about projects, again, is there's no set stipulated structure. It's really to say that it starts with what is it that you really need to deliver on this engagement. And then within the team itself, it's a fairly diverse set. You've got a lot of people, interestingly, are from design practices who've picked on ethnographic research in a very different way. There are people who've come in from the business side who've picked up, just the translation again from a research to a design lens in a very different way. So then it kind of comes down to how much of this is strategy, how much of this is going to be in terms of storytelling or narratives. And then you do decide, how even within the same project, there actually might be opportunities where different people come in very quickly, assemble something, move out, and then it moves ahead. So that way it's very agile and it keeps evolving.
Super. So I think we've got a sense of your journey, academic and then work, and it seems that you're loving what you're doing. That's always good to know.
Yeah.
I'm going to switch gears and give you a few rapid fire questions.
All right.
So the first one is, if you were to name 1, 2, or 3 influencers, people you follow or are inspired by, who would they be?
People I follow. Okay, so then so I would say it's an interesting mix again. So one of the people who really influenced me very early on was, interestingly, Madhu Trehan. So she is a journalist, but it's just her way of looking and approaching things, which kind of was always, just getting down to that degree of what is interesting. The other one I would say is this gentleman called Jan Chipchase. He writes a lot about ethnographic research. He writes a lot about just, again, getting into deeper insights. The third person, interestingly, I would say is my own mother, to be very honest, because I think just the ability for her to, over time, navigate both the professional and the personal front. I think when I look at myself, I feel I wish I had that balance. So these are the three.
Great. Next question. If you were to reflect on an embarrassing moment or a disappointment or a failure, what was the learning from that moment or those moments?
I think for me, the consistent one has been where I've been too close to the outcome, too close to the notion of what the outcome would be in my mind to realize that it wouldn't have worked. So I think the failures actually were necessary. And they've kind of taught me just to be like, give it your best shot, but there will always be some things which may translate differently. You may not even know the specificities of how those things are. So you need to be flexible around how you're approaching it. And yeah, sometimes the journey kind of then adds up more. You need to then also know when to say no to something. So those have been my learnings broadly.
All right. One more. So there's Megha has so many strengths. We've learned about it just by hearing. But if you were to pick 3 words that describe your strengths or capture those strengths well, what are the 3 words you'll pick?
Okay. I think one is just, I don't know. I don't think the word is perseverance, but yeah, like if I really want to get down to something, I think I will figure out a way to do it. The second one, for a lot of time, for me, has been a strength that I like being a generalist. From the very onset, and purely from an academic or a professional route, we've always had this thing about saying pick a specialization. But I think that's my strength, that I can connect dots between different fields, design or otherwise, marketing, sales, post sales, design, all of this coming together. I think that is an interesting ability that, in a way, you're sort of multilingual in a very different thing. So you don't have to go to too deep, but there is an opportunity there. And I think the third, somewhere, would be maybe the fact that there is a certain sense of earnestness with which you do operate. So I'll be honest that I've been in places where I didn't know how to even get on with day one, but people have possibly given me the benefit of doubt because of that. And I think that to a great extent has enabled me as well.
That's great. I think that's the humility, and you're sort of going into something you're unfamiliar, but knowing
Yes.
that you can ask for help or ask for whatever advice to get going. Super. I think these are very interesting, especially, the whole interest in learning, though you didn't directly say it, but obviously it was completely implied throughout your journey. Uh, and then the way you looked at your journey in design and sharing all the insights was very useful for all our listeners. I'm just thinking of 3 or 4 students I know currently who would love to connect with you because they have that aesthetic, but they know that they need to do something else. And your journey in school and college and the B school, using all the electives and other opportunities at work to also use those skills and become better, has been really great as something for us to know. So I will invite you to a panel. We'll
Awesome.
do a session which is more career focused for young people and different paths that they could navigate. They don't have to decide now. Like you said, it evolves over a period of
Yes.
time. But yes, we are so happy that I'm so happy that we could connect again after so many years. So really looking forward to keeping that connection alive. Thank you so much.
Now, thanks for this opportunity, Arjun, and it's always a delight to speak to you. So this has been great. Hello.